I was the president of Columbia Pictures, and I left Columbia, and I read a little article in a Long Island newspaper about a young man who escaped a Turkish prison, and the story of his tale seemed to intrigue me. I had been involved at Columbia with lots of very unique films, from Last Picture Show to Taxi Driver to Last Detail, and these kinds of films and subjects were intriguing to me. So I hunted down Billy Hayes in England. There was no book, there was no nothing, there was just the articles, and got in touch with him, brought him to the United States, brought him to Los Angeles, and began talking to him, and ultimately acquired the film rights for the material. Then what happened was we started to figure out how we could develop this material into a movie. And we auditioned a number of writers at that time, screenwriters, young screenwriters, and went through many, and then met this young gentleman who was intrigued by the material, and he gave us a screenplay to read. It was a kind of a war picture about a platoon of soldiers, and it wasn't something that we were going to make. Somebody did later, you can figure that out. And we said, let's go with him. He's a young screenwriter, and the studio didn't want to spend a lot of money. They were quite frightened of the picture. And so we said, okay, let's go with him. And that was Oliver Stone. And Oliver began writing the screenplay and working on the research of it. And what happened was, around that time, when we were developing the project, it was either subsequent to that event or right near that, David Putnam became the president of my company, Casablanca Record and Films. And I was an old friend of David, and David an old friend of mine, because while I was at Columbia, I made movies with him in London as an independent producer. He was quite a good independent producer even then. And he became the president of my company.
I signed a deal to do 2 years in California, working for a company that Peter co-owned with Neil Bogart, called Casablanca. And built into the deal was that I would produce with Alan Marshall Midnight Express, which was a book I by that time read. So it was a kind of package. It was a package for me that I took on a role in the US for a couple of years that included the production of Midnight Express. I pretty well almost the same time met Oliver, and from memory, I liked his take on it. I found him very energetic guy, and the most attractive thing of all for me was that it was a kind of part of the package was that Alan Parker and Alan Marshall be involved. So it was a great piece of good fortune, because Peter at that point wanted this entire package, we were able to negotiate up quite usefully. So in a way, Peter got me, but then he also got Parker. He knew that I'd worked with Parker on Bugsy, and so one way or another, it was one of those. It was a very sweet deal for everyone involved, and from my point of view, it's extraordinary because I got paid on it more than I'd got for the previous 10 films all put together. So it was financially, it was a real breakthrough.
The concept of the film was always anxiety-provoking for Columbia Pictures. The subject matter and the period of time that we were making the film in, there was a complete group of folks at Columbia, including the chairman of Columbia, who was trying to persuade me not to make the film, really not to make the film. This wouldn't be a good move for me. I had just finished a film which was very, very successful for Columbia that I produced called The Deep. And I was forced to be cross-collateralized. That means the profit from The Deep would be used to protect any loss from Midnight Express. That's what they did in those days. Try to bundle two pictures together to protect the studio. And I didn't have to make Midnight Express, and I would protect all my profits from The Deep. But I sucked up the air and said, okay, I'm gonna roll the dice. And so the idea of the film, making the film and the design of the film, was a lot of people involved, a lot of folks, from David and Alan and Oliver and myself, of course, and the studio. So ultimately, it was a true collaborative effort.
I arrived in, I think it was late April 1977, and the film was far from green-lit. It was a project with a script that the studio liked, and I was in place to try and move it along. The big issue was casting. The studio were very, very keen on Richard Gere in particular. He just had a very successful movie, I think, called Blood Brothers. But it'd been very good, and he'd got terrific reviews. And a whole series of meetings occurred between Alan Parker and Richard that I'd set up. And these meetings, I think there were 3 or 4 of them, went sort of from bad to worse because Richard's sense of insecurity about the part, or the way in which he wanted to address the part, began to undermine Alan's confidence in the screenplay. And so in a sense, in persuading an actor to come on board, I had a director who was rapidly losing his confidence. And in the end, one night, almost a tearful conversation with Alan, I said, look, I have nothing else to say to him. I cannot answer any more questions. I've had it. Now, by this time, we'd also cast and screen tested a number of people, and they included Sam Bottoms, who was very good, Dennis Quaid, and Brad Davis. And we had 3 terrific sets of tests, and a very tough decision, leaving Richard to one side, between Brad and particularly between Brad and Dennis. Dennis had been utterly outstanding. We tested 3 scenes. Dennis was absolutely outstanding in one of the scenes, the courtroom scene, absolutely extraordinary, and was good in the others. Whereas Brad was that bit better in all of them. And also Brad had a vulnerability that Dennis, in a sense, didn't have. I was always very keen that 2/3 of the way through the movie, you would begin to think he was not going to survive. This kid was just not going to make it. And I felt that was quite important. And Brad had that implicitly.
Brad eventually got the role, and it was, I had lunch with it. And in fact, there was a very funny story, because Alan said to me, look, because we thought Richard Gere was going to take the role, and he said, could you go and have lunch with Brad over at Universal and just say how sorry we are that he's not going to get the role, because we really wanted him to do it, but the studio has that control. And so I had lunch, and it was awful. And I said, I'm sorry. We thought your screen test was fantastic. You would be absolutely perfect for the role, but we can't control the studio. And he was really understanding, and I took him down the hill and dropped him off, and I saw him nip across the one of the main roads and I thought, well, that's going to be the end of it. And then I think it was literally 4 weeks later, he was in London being fitted for what rags we could stick on him.
But Alan really read him, looked at him, and David looked at him. David has a really terrific eye. He's a very smart fella. And Marshall jumped in, everybody jumped in and felt he was the right person. Once you're on the river and the rapids are ahead and you can't get to shore, you're best to try to give the crew its due and try to make it through. And I think that at that point, the studio realized that they really weren't in charge, that the momentum had been achieved by the picture and the director, and so that they've said, okay, we rolled the dice this far, we'll support them. Well, it was a very small film. I mean, you got to understand, Midnight Express, you think of it in today's terms, the whole budget of Midnight Express isn't the catering bill for most films today. I mean, you're talking about a film that was about $1,700,000, $1,800,000. And, even then it wasn't a very expensive film. So there wasn't a lot of attention being paid for it because it was an economic engine, either in terms of reward or expense. And the people involved, none of them were stars. The only folks that were known was me and David. I mean, in the heart of the matter. And I had a lot of momentum because I used to be the president of the company. So I had some leverage in the thing, and I had a big hit picture that had just come out. So the idea of being here, we went back and forth. David was there a lot, and I went back and forth to Malta a number of times. But Alan had to carry the day. And we were very careful because we knew those dailies being showed at the studio was going to cause a problem. I had those problems before with Taxi Driver and Last Detail and Tommy, where the film was controversial in the making and the dailies would frighten the management. So managing the expectations of the studio wasn't hard because they had no expectations. What we were trying to do is not get shut down by the studio because they got frightened of the film. And the scariest moment in the making of the film was suddenly Alan called one day and said, we're done. I said, well, you got 4 more days of shooting. I said, but what about the ending? What about when he swims across the Bosporus Straits and goes through the minefield? No, we're going to end it when he comes out of the prison.
We finished the film, our film, what we thought was our film, and 10, I think it was about 8 pages earlier than the actual film script that Oliver had written.
I said, what? I said, they're going to kill me at the studio. They think that's the action part of the action-adventure picture. You're going to take that out. He said, "No, Peter, trust me, it won't work. I looked at the way the film was shot. I said, oh, trust you, I know, but it's scary. It's scary because that's what they think. Oh, that should be a great, exciting piece for the trailer and the sell of the picture."
I then went back and got into a very complicated negotiation with the studio, who were very unhappy about this, saying, look, frankly, we would like to finish the film on page, I'm making this up, page 108, and we think the last 14 pages are unnecessary. Have you read your contract? Contract says you've got to do it, all that. And I brokered a compromise, which was, look, let us do this. We were pretty on the edge of the budget anyway. Let us do this. If we've failed, if we're wrong, it's a separate shoot anyway. We'll come back and we'll shoot those sequences, and if necessary, you can dock our salaries for some of the costs, etc., etc. But let's only do it when we know that our instincts are wrong.
Well, you had to defend the filmmaker, you had to support him, and I did support him, and certainly David supported him, and Alan supported him. So the idea is we went with that. And when we told the studio that we weren't shooting the ending of the picture, they went ballistic. David Beagleman, who was then the chairman of the company, called me like 4 times and said, that's absolutely unacceptable. You know, you've got the money in the budget, the money, you haven't overspent it, you're on budget, just shoot it and we'll have it. I said, why don't you call Alan and see if you can persuade him to shoot it and have it. He's just not going to do that because he's afraid that you're going to put it in no matter what he thinks. And he said, I am going to put it in no matter what he thinks. I said, well, there you go. So that's how the film ended, too, with Billy Hayes coming out of prison, clicking his heels, and being free. Because Alan made a very cogent comment. He said, the real heart of the story as it evolved in the filmmaking was his trials and tribulations in the prison, the system, how he behaved there, what happened to him. It was a cautionary tale. And to change the texture of the film at the last 10 minutes and make it an action-adventure film has the accent on the wrong syllable, you know? So his argument held merit, you know? I mean, it really had merit in every sense. And so it wasn't just a egocentric exercise on the part of Alan Parker. He really, as a filmmaker crafting this film from the screenplay with all the notes and the conversations, had to make a fundamental creative judgment, and he made the right one.
Before showing it to the studio, we showed it to 1 or 2 friends, which included a woman who was married to a guy who had a lot of, I'll get the names out of it, but had a lot of faith in, experienced studio executive, if you like. And she absolutely freaked out 2/3 of the way through the film and ran out. Particularly to do with the cat. That's what finally did it for her. And that was pretty alarming. I think we hadn't anticipated that sort of reaction. So we were a bit tense. We did eventually then, obviously, screen it for the studio. And it's better Alan tells this story than I do, but we screened it and everything was going fine until we got towards the end of the film, and suddenly the projectionist got the reels in the wrong order. And we're suddenly looking at the penultimate reel, and I went, I mean, you're tense, you're nervous anyway. I went utterly ballistic, right, racing back to the projection box. I said, what the fuck's going on? And the guy said, whoa, what's the matter? What's the matter? And for some extraordinary reason, I don't know why, I've never done it before or since, the reels were lettered, not numbered. I said, you've got the wrong reel up. He said, no, I haven't. I don't. And I said, you have. He said, no, A, B, C, D, R, fuck, H, I, R, fuck, H. And he had. Right? He didn't know his F and his H and his I and his J, you know. So I whacked him. And the next thing I knew, I'm on the ground in the projection box. I got the head of the studio walking in, pulling us apart. Alan's there. Alan, it's better, in a sense, much better Alan tells his story. And mayhem. And in an odd way, wasn't intentional. It was a good thing to happen because it demonstrated the seriousness of what had happened. We'd had a not dissimilar experience, funnily enough, on Bugsy Malone with Barry Diller, but that's another story. And the tension that was involved. Anyway, it was all right. And in the end, the screening, I think, went very well. I mean, people were blown away by the movie. I mean, even if you didn't like it, you were blown away by the movie. Some people loved it and were blown away. Some people didn't like it, but blown away.
To understand Cannes, you have to understand the backstory, because without the context, Cannes is just a place where the film was first exhibited. The context was that Columbia, Norman Levy was a champion, who was a distributor, liked the film when he first saw it. David Begelman, who was going through his own trials and tribulations, didn't really admire the film. I mean, he didn't dislike the qualitative aspects of it, but he didn't feel comfortable with what the film, portrayed. And the idea of going to Cannes wasn't to launch the film, or to praise the film. It was to really put the film aside, say, hey, look, it's not going to work. It'll vaporize. And Cannes is a scary place to launch the first public screening of a movie. I mean, it's really throwing all the marbles on the table at one shot. And what happened was very unusual at Cannes. First of all, what usually occurs is that there's press screenings that start in the morning at 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Then there's the big screening in the Palais at night. And there was a kind of feeling amongst the Columbia brass that they just like this thing to get through and go on to the next project. And when we went to the screening, I went to the screening room at big screening in the old Palais at 10 o'clock, and usually a lot of the press comes at the 10 o'clock screening. There were very few press there, maybe 20%, 15%, very, very few. And it looked like a catastrophe because the press weren't showing up, and it was, oh my God. And I know for my own self, my own story is a little different. I went off and got completely whacked drunk. I went up to Column d'Or, drank, took my wife and some friends, because I just couldn't bear the whole thing cratering, not only creatively, because I believed in the film and the filmmakers and the project, but also financially. It would have been a debacle for me. And so I got completely sloshed. And I wandered back into Cannes around 4:30 and bumped into Rona Barrett, who was then a very, very, very important commentator about popular Hollywood projects, people, personalities. She was People magazine personified for television networks. And I had known her for a number of years. And she came strolling up to me in the street and said, oh, I want to see Midnight Express tonight. Can I get 4 tickets? I said, you can get 6, you can get 8, you can get 10, you can get 12, as many as you want. You want to lay down? Really? Yeah, can I get 8? No problem, I'll go get 8 for you. Figuring the place is going to be empty. So I strolled over to the Palais. At that time, they had like a will call box office. You could pick up extra seats and such. I walked up to the booth and I said, I'd like to get 6 tickets or 8 tickets for Midnight Express tonight. He said, oh, no. I said, well, I'm the producer, executive producer, owner, head of the studio. Can I get the tickets? He said, you could be king of France. There are no tickets. I said, why? He said, because they're all gone. They're all gone. After the first thing, I thought, how could they be all gone? Yeah, they're all gone. He said, well, nobody was there this morning, the press. He said, yeah, but by 2 o'clock, there were 10,000 people and 50 million, picketers in front of the theater, picketing and screaming and yelling and carrying on. There wasn't a ticket to be had, and the press people were jammed in. Huh. That freaked me out a little bit because I didn't know what was going to happen that night. So we go that night, and there was a lot of buzz and a lot of noise, kind of like uncomfortableness. And the French audience can be very fickle. They can boo, they can get up, they can stomp, they can walk out. They're not immune to the niceties of being polite in the theater. And we all sat together, and the film played, and there was a few bumps and grinds, and people were anxious in the film. And we had never seen it really at all in a public screening. It hadn't been previewed. So that's a pretty scary thing. And the film played, the film finished, and we knew that there was something was wrong because they didn't applaud. Nothing happened. And Alan and myself and David and all looked at each other, ooh, this is not good. And then the credits ended, and 2,000 people stood up and gave it a standing ovation. So we went from the depths of cataclysmic failure to the heights of euphoria in 1 minute. In 1 minute. And then the film took off. And then everybody, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan in our business. Everybody had something to do with the film. The one champion in the studio who was really remarkable was a man named Norman Levy, who was the head of distribution, who worked for me when I was running Columbia. He's passed away, but he was truly a believer. He didn't need the social proof of the film playing. He knew in his heart that this film was going to work.
The showing, the evening, was wonderful. I mean, it was very well received, and we came out. We were favourites to win the Palme d'Or, I think. But the next morning, you have the press conference, and we were very naive in those days. I mean, we weren't that young actually, but we were probably young in film terms. We certainly were young in film terms, but we got a great deal of criticism, mostly because I think they thought that we had never shown a Turkish person in any good light, that there was no good Turks in the movie. And we said, well, within the circumstances of being in a prison, we didn't expect to find too many nice Turks. But that was a great deal of the criticism. Of course, that criticism I don't think ever came this side of the Atlantic, because I don't think it was criticised for any of its political connotations in the USA, whereas in Europe it was, I mean, there was in Holland somebody set fire to a cinema that the film was running in. In Germany it failed miserably at the box office because during the late 60s and early 70s, there was a huge influx of Turkish workers into the German community. And so it had major criticism in many areas, and mostly I think because of this whole political situation, that they wanted us to show an even balance, and we didn't show that even balance. Everybody was nasty in the movie. Even the inmates were nasty, as well as the judge, and not so much the judge, but certainly the prosecutor was a nasty piece of work.
There was a marvellous man called David Matalon, who at the time was overseas sales director for Columbia. He bore the brunt of a lot of this because he was going around having to deal with local distributors, and he was amazing. We had a couple of court cases. One I remember definitely in Holland about the opening of the film. To an extent, David and others protected us from a lot of that. And it wasn't until we started going out promoting the film that we, in a way, came up against it.
The film had one of those unique moments in the ether of the film business that flies in the face of gravity. Films would open, and the first week would always be the best, and the second, the next, and the third, and the fourth. And at that time in the world, in the 70s, films played for 15, 16 weeks, 14 weeks, 13 weeks. And they started out with 40 theaters, 20 theaters, 10 theaters, 2 theaters, you know, and expanded. They don't open in 6,000 screens, you know, internationally, including Phuket, Thailand at the same time. They opened in, you know, the west side of New York, the east side of New York, Hollywood Boulevard, West Los Angeles, maybe Chicago, maybe, you know, Michigan Avenue. I mean, 3 sites. That's the way this film started. And they figured that would be the end of it. And the film opened kind of soft. And it disappointed Norman Levy, who was the big distribution fan of the picture. It kind of soft. We weren't disappointed. We thought it was okay. And the reviews were quite good. Very good. But the audience reaction was fantastic. Fantastic. And suddenly, the second week, it actually went up. And the third week, it went up. And then it expanded and went up the fourth week. So that everybody was talking about. How can the film be improving?
I think early on they realised they had a good movie, which with good promotion could make money. I think the level of success amazed them. I mean, it did return remarkable percentage of its investment. I mean, look at it pound for pound, one of the most successful films probably ever made, because it was so relatively inexpensive. A bit like the Full Monty, you know, our films that look at what they cost, look at what they gross, and you think, God, if every movie could do that, everyone would be in this business. Goober's got to take a lot of credit for the fact that he really did push for a marketing budget that was, you know, was weighty. He is very, very good at the promotional aspects of filmmaking. I learned a lot from him in that area. But the genius behind the ads and everything else, I think, was Alan. Alan understood what the power of the film was, and understood how to promote the power of the film.
About a year later, in England, it played as a double bill with another film, Taxi Driver, which I started with as at Columbia. And I said to somebody in the paper, which got quoted, they should stand outside the theater and arrest everybody that comes out of the theater. To watch those two films in a row, you got to be really hardcore.